The live feed flickered on my tablet screen, illuminating my face in the darkened room. My breath hitched, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. There, in my mother's living room, was the woman I had trusted implicitly, the woman I had paid handsomely, the woman I had hailed as an angel. But she wasn't gently assisting my frail mother, or reading to her, or even simply watching over her. Instead, she was rifling through my mother's purse, her movements swift and practiced, pulling out a wad of cash with a callous disregard that made my blood run cold. My mother, bless her gentle heart, was asleep in her armchair, completely oblivious to the violation. This single, damning image, captured by the tiny camera hidden amongst the dusty books, confirmed my deepest, most horrifying fears. It was not just petty theft, it was a profound betrayal, a cruel exploitation of vulnerability, and the first piece of irrefutable evidence in what would become her spectacular, well-deserved downfall. I had hired what I believed to be the perfect caregiver for my elderly mother, a woman with glowing references and a compassionate demeanor. But slowly, unsettling signs began to emerge, whispering doubts into my mind. What began as a creeping suspicion soon blossomed into a terrifying certainty that my mother and our family were being systematically exploited. This story is about how I, an ordinary daughter consumed by fear and a thirst for justice, uncovered the horrifying truth hidden behind a facade of kindness, leading to a meticulously planned, devastating act of revenge. My mother, Eleanor, had always been the radiant sun in my life. A former librarian with a quick wit and an endless supply of comforting stories, she had navigated life's challenges with grace and resilience. Even as the gentle creeping shadows of dementia began to cloud her sharp mind in her late 70s, her spirit remained indomitable, her smiles still capable of lighting up a room. For many years, I had managed her care myself, balancing my full-time job as a technical writer with daily visits, doctor's appointments, and managing her household. It was a juggling act, exhausting at times, but filled with the quiet joy of being there for the woman who had given me everything. However, as her condition progressed, the demands became too great for me to handle alone. Her moments of confusion grew more frequent, her physical frailty more pronounced. After much agonizing and with a heavy heart, I realized we needed professional assistance. I poured countless hours into researching home care agencies and independent caregivers, seeking someone truly compassionate, someone trustworthy, someone who would treat my mother with the dignity and love she deserved. That is when Clara arrived. Clara Jenkins. She was referred by a trusted family friend who swore by her gentle nature and impeccable professionalism. Clara was in her early 50s, with kind eyes, a soft voice, and an aura of calm competence. She spoke beautifully about the philosophy of person-centered care, about cherishing the memories of her own beloved grandmother, and about the sacred trust involved in caring for the elderly. Her references were stellar, full of effusive praise for her dedication and reliability. She promised to treat my mother like her own family, and her initial interactions with Eleanor were nothing short of angelic. My mother, usually wary of strangers in her increasing confusion, seemed to genuinely warm to Clara, often reaching for her hand or smiling when Clara spoke. A wave of immense relief washed over me. It felt like a weight had been lifted, a burden I hadn't realized was crushing me. I could finally breathe, trusting that my mother was in safe, loving hands while I was at work. Clara quickly became an indispensable part of our lives. She managed my mother's medications with precision, prepared her meals, kept her comfortable, and even engaged her in gentle activities like listening to old radio dramas or looking through family photo albums. She seemed to anticipate Eleanor's needs before my mother even voiced them, a truly remarkable quality. I often found myself telling friends and colleagues that Clara was a godsend, a true blessing. My job as a technical writer, while not as dramatic as an investigator, demanded meticulous attention to detail and a methodical approach to problem solving. These skills, honed over 2 decades of crafting precise instruction manuals and debugging complex software documentation, would, ironically, become my most powerful tools in the silent battle that was about to unfold. I was used to looking for discrepancies, for inconsistencies in data, for the subtle errors that could derail an entire system. I just never imagined I would apply them to scrutinize the person I had welcomed into the most vulnerable part of my life. The trust one placed in Clara was absolute, blinding me to the subtle shifts, the faint dissonances that would, in time, become impossible to ignore. My world felt stable, balanced, and finally, peaceful. I was profoundly wrong. The first crack in my carefully constructed piece appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a tiny fissure in a solid wall. It began with small, unexplainable discrepancies. My mother's favorite brand of tea, which I bought in bulk, seemed to vanish faster than usual. Or a specific, well-loved blanket would disappear from her armchair, only to reappear days later in a different room, neatly folded, but never where it should have been. These were minor things, easily dismissed as my mother's increasing confusion or my own oversight. "Oh, Mom probably just put it away somewhere," I'd tell myself, or maybe I just miscounted the tea bags. Then, the financial anomalies started. Small amounts of cash, perhaps $20 or $30, would occasionally be missing from my mother's purse. At first, I blamed my own forgetfulness, or attributed it to my mother giving money to visiting grandchildren without telling me. But the pattern became more consistent, the amounts adding up. Then, an electricity bill arrived that was significantly higher than usual, despite no apparent change in my mother's energy consumption habits. I called the utility company, puzzled, but they confirmed the meter readings. Clara was the only other person consistently in the house. A cold prickle of unease started to spread through me. I tried to rationalize it. Clara had seemed so kind, so trustworthy. It must be a misunderstanding, a mistake. But the doubts, once planted, began to fester. The turning point arrived one Tuesday afternoon. I had called my mother, as I did every day, during Clara's shift. My mother sounded unusually distressed, her voice thin and reedy. "Clara won't let me have my biscuits," she whispered, her words slurring slightly. "She says I'm not allowed anymore. And she yelled at me, dear." She yelled. My heart lurched. Clara had strict instructions about my mother's diet, but never about withholding food, and certainly never about yelling. My mother hated confrontation. When Clara answered the phone a moment later, her voice was all sweetness and light. "Oh, Eleanor is just a little confused today," she chirped. She wanted to eat all the biscuits, and I had to gently remind her about her sugar levels. You know how sensitive she can be. Her tone was perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable, almost too perfect. But the image of my mother's terrified whisper, the distinct slur in her voice, clung to my mind. My mother, in her increasing fragility, was a terrible liar. She was also terrified of being a bother. That night, I couldn't sleep. The financial discrepancies, the vanishing items, and now my mother's distressed whisper. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern, and the pattern pointed directly at Clara. My gut screamed betrayal. The angel I had welcomed into our home, the woman I had trusted with my mother's precious well-being, was no angel at all. A sickening realization washed over me. My mother was vulnerable, isolated, and potentially being abused. And I, her only protector, had unknowingly placed her directly into harm's way. A fierce, protective rage surged through me, eclipsing my fear. I knew then, with chilling certainty, that I had to find out the truth, whatever the cost. The days following my mother's distressed phone call were a blur of meticulous planning and suppressed rage. I couldn't confront Clara directly. If my suspicions were wrong, I would alienate the only caregiver my mother seemed comfortable with. If I was right, a direct confrontation might make Clara flee, destroy evidence, or worse, retaliate against my vulnerable mother. No, I needed proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof. My background in technical writing had instilled in me a methodical approach to problems, a need for data, for concrete evidence. This was no different. My first step was research. I spent hours online, delving into forums for families with elderly parents, reading about signs of caregiver abuse, and researching discreet home surveillance options. I learned about tiny cameras, motion-activated, with long battery lives and cloud storage. It felt invasive, a violation of privacy, but the thought of my mother's whispered fear outweighed any moral qualms. I chose a discreet camera designed to look like a common household object, a small, unassuming air freshener. It was surprisingly easy to set up. The next day, I arrived at my mother's house just before Clara's shift ended, feigning a sudden need to pick up some documents. While Clara was busy preparing my mother's light dinner, I quickly installed the camera in the living room, strategically placing it on a bookshelf, partially obscured by books, yet with a clear view of the armchair, the television, and the pathway to the kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest as I worked, a mix of fear and grim determination. I activated the camera, connecting it to a secure app on my phone. The tiny red light on the device, almost invisible to the naked eye, blinked once, confirming it was recording. I left the house feeling a strange mix of dread and anticipation. I knew that what I might discover could be devastating, but the need to protect my mother was paramount. I checked the live feed incessantly that evening, seeing only my mother watching television, Clara tidying up, seemingly normal scenes. But I knew the camera was there, silently watching, waiting to reveal the truth, whatever it might be. The waiting was agony, a constant gnawing at my peace. For the next few days, the footage was unremarkable. Clara performed her duties with apparent diligence. My anxieties began to recede, replaced by a sense of foolishness. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just my mother's confusion. Then came that afternoon, the one that broke my heart and solidified my resolve. I was at my desk at work, pretending to focus on a complex technical manual, when a notification popped up on my phone. Motion detected. Living room. I clicked on the live feed, my heart hammering against my ribs. What I saw unfolded like a horror movie. Clara was standing over my sleeping mother, not with care, but with a predatory focus. She rummaged through my mother's purse, then discreetly slipped a few bills into her own pocket. My stomach churned. This was it. This was the proof. But it didn't stop there. Later, I watched as Clara openly helped herself to a generous portion of my mother's expensive nutritional supplements, scoffing them down as if they were her own. Then, a few hours later, I saw her, with a distinct sneer on her face, refuse to give my mother her requested biscuit, even though I knew there was an entire box clearly visible in the pantry. "You've had enough," Clara snapped, her voice devoid of the usual saccharine sweetness. "Go to sleep." My mother looked bewildered, hurt, then simply turned her face away. The raw cruelty in Clara's tone, the blatant disregard for my mother's feelings, was a physical blow. Over the next 2 weeks, the footage accumulated, painting an increasingly grim picture. There were more instances of petty theft, of Clara consuming my mother's groceries and supplies. More instances of verbal abuse, subtle at first, then increasingly overt. Sharp words, impatient sighs, dismissive tones, all directed at my sweet, confused mother. I saw Clara ignore my mother's calls for help, leave her unattended for extended periods while she scrolled on her phone, and even, on one terrifying occasion, deliberately push a glass of water just out of my mother's reach as my mother strained to grab it. The angel was a tormentor. Armed with this undeniable video evidence, I began to cross-reference the thefts with my mother's bank statements and utility bills. The missing cash correlated perfectly with large, unexplainable withdrawals from my mother's account. The spikes in the electricity bill, I realized, were from Clara leaving lights on all night or running the television constantly in the living room, even when she wasn't actively watching it, while my mother was confined to her bedroom. I uncovered a pattern of deliberate financial exploitation alongside the neglect and verbal abuse. Clara wasn't just stealing, she was systematically draining my mother's resources while causing her emotional distress. My rage reached a boiling point, cold and precise. The scope of Clara's deception grew wider with each passing day. I meticulously documented every incident, creating a detailed log synchronized with the video timestamps. I had enough for a criminal case, but I wanted more. I wanted to ensure Clara would never harm another vulnerable person again. I began researching Clara Jenkins herself, using the same methodical online investigation techniques I'd refined over years of technical research. I delved into public records, social media, under a fake profile, of course, and even professional caregiving registries. What I found was shocking. Clara Jenkins had a history. Not of criminal convictions that would show up on a standard background check, but a pattern of complaints from previous clients, vague accusations of unprofessional conduct, discrepancies in billing, and poor communication. These had never escalated to formal charges, perhaps due to the vulnerability or fear of the families involved. More chillingly, I discovered an old, archived online forum post from a desperate daughter in another state, detailing almost identical patterns of behavior from a caregiver matching Clara's description. A caregiver who had mysteriously disappeared after a family threatened legal action. The pieces began to fit together, revealing not just a single instance of abuse, but a predatory pattern, a systemic exploitation strategy. Clara was a professional scam artist, preying on vulnerable families. My final piece of the puzzle came from a seemingly innocuous detail. My mother's rare coin collection, a sentimental heirloom, had been subtly rearranged. I had a precise mental map of its display. A few specific, valuable coins were missing. This wasn't petty cash. This was grand larceny. Clara had been stealing my mother's most treasured possessions, assuming the elderly, confused woman would never notice, and that I would blame my mother's own failing memory. My evidence was now overwhelming. Video proof of theft, neglect, and verbal abuse, financial records showing exploitation, and a historical pattern of similar predatory behavior from Clara. The trap was set. I decided to make the reveal during Clara's next shift, ensuring I had fresh footage of her actions and that my mother would be safely asleep in her room, spared from the devastating confrontation. My heart was heavy with the pain of betrayal, but lighter with the grim satisfaction that justice was finally, irrevocably coming. The day of reckoning dawned, bright and deceptively peaceful. I had taken the day off work, telling Clara I had a doctor's appointment but would be back to check on my mother. She had smiled, her usual angelic facade firmly in place. I arrived at the house precisely at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, just as the hidden camera showed Clara in the living room, brazenly trying on one of my mother's antique silver bracelets, admiring it in the reflection of the television screen. My mother was, thankfully, dozing soundly in her bedroom, oblivious. I unlocked the front door, pushing it open quietly. Clara startled, her hand flying to her chest. The bracelet clattered onto the coffee table. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear mixed with confusion crossing her face. "Oh, Patricia, you're back early. Doctor's appointment finished quickly?" Her voice was still sweet, but tinged with a nervous edge. I walked directly into the living room, my gaze fixed on her. My hands were steady, my voice calm, but with an underlying steel that I knew would convey the absolute end of her charade. "Yes, Clara," I said, picking up the bracelet. "The appointment finished, and it seems I've arrived just in time to catch you in the middle of yours." Her face went pale. My appointment? I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," I countered, my eyes burning into hers. "You see, Clara, for the past several weeks, I've had a very special assistant helping me keep an eye on things here. A silent, ever-vigilant assistant." I then reached up to the bookshelf and, with a swift movement, pulled down the unassuming air freshener, holding it up for her to see. Her eyes fixed on the tiny lens, the blood draining from her face. This little device, Clara, I continued, has captured everything. Every time you rummaged through my mother's purse, every time you helped yourself to her expensive supplements, every time you spoke to her with contempt and neglect. It recorded you refusing her biscuits, pushing her water glass away, and leaving her alone for hours while you scrolled on your phone. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a cornered animal. And it recorded you, I added, my voice dropping to a low, chilling tone, admiring my mother's antique silver bracelet just moments ago. A bracelet, Clara, that is part of a collection from which several valuable coins have recently gone missing. I then pulled out my phone, quickly navigating to the app, and began playing a montage of clips: Clara stealing cash, Clara verbally abusing my mother, Clara neglecting her, Clara taking the supplements, and finally, the shot of her trying on the bracelet. The video played in chilling silence, each clip more damning than the last. Clara watched, transfixed, her face a mask of dawning horror and utter defeat. This, Clara, I stated, pausing the video, is just a fraction of the evidence. I have weeks of footage. I have bank statements correlating with your thefts. I have a detailed log of every instance of neglect and abuse. And I have also uncovered your little history, Clara. The complaints from previous families, the mysterious disappearances. You are not an angel. You are a predator. Her eyes darted around the room, frantic, desperate. She stammered, You can't. This is an invasion of privacy. This isn't legal. I held up my phone, then revealed my other hand, which held a neatly folded document. On the contrary, Clara, when a vulnerable person is suspected of being exploited, surveillance is absolutely legal, especially on private property. And this, I said, unfolding the document, is a formal complaint I filed this morning with the Adult Protective Services, the local police department, and the state's Caregiver Licensing Board. They have already reviewed a summary of my evidence, and they are on their way. I believe they will be very interested in your invasion of privacy defense, as well as the evidence of felony theft and elder abuse. A tremor went through her body. She collapsed into the armchair my mother usually occupied, tears streaming down her face. Please, she sobbed, please don't do this. I'll give it all back. I'll leave. Just please. Her pleas were pathetic, devoid of genuine remorse, only fear. But it was too late. The front door chime sounded, announcing the arrival of the authorities. The angel was finally exposed, her reign of terror over. The arrival of the authorities was swift and efficient. Clara Jenkins was questioned, then arrested on the spot. The mountain of evidence I had meticulously gathered left no room for doubt. The police recovered some of my mother's stolen coins and cash from Clara's belongings. The Adult Protective Services launched a full investigation, which led to Clara's immediate and permanent revocation of her caregiving license, ensuring she could never exploit another vulnerable person under the guise of compassion. Her name was flagged, her career as a caregiver utterly destroyed. It was a long, emotionally draining process, but the relief was immense. My mother, thankfully, was largely spared the distress of the confrontation itself, and the authorities assured me she would not need to testify in court due to the overwhelming video evidence. We eventually found a new caregiver, a truly kind and professional woman named Maria, who has brought genuine warmth and peace back into our home. My mother, though still affected by her dementia, is now genuinely content and safe. This experience, while horrifying, taught me the vital importance of trusting your gut instinct, even when it's uncomfortable. It reinforced the necessity of vigilance, especially when caring for those who cannot fully protect themselves. Most importantly, it showed me that even an ordinary person, armed with determination and meticulousness, can uncover the darkest truths and bring a powerful form of justice. The seemingly small, unsettling details often hide the most profound betrayals. Isn't it true that the most dangerous wolves often wear the most convincing sheep's clothing?